Is Georgia going to have to play the NIL game a little bit differently if it wants to get back to where it was a couple of years ago, dominating teams week in and week out during the regular season, dominating teams in the college football playoff, and winning back-to-back national championships? If Georgia wants to get back to that, does it need to take the NIL game a little bit more seriously? That's my question. I don't know how much money Georgia has spent in NIL for this current season. I don't know how much they spent on the team. I don't know what the payroll was, and certain players have deals with their own companies and all of that. But you look at the reports about Ohio State and how they paid $20 million for their roster, and you see how they're playing in the playoffs. They're dominating schools, dominating Oregon, dominating Tennessee, playing in the national championship tonight in Atlanta against Notre Dame, a team that has used NIL but also kind of built from within. So there's kind of two sides to it. We saw just a year ago with that Michigan squad, that was largely a team that was pretty much built from the ground up. And that's what Georgia was a couple of years ago. So we're seeing the immediate changes now in this season. A lot of things are different with NIL, transfer portal. The college football playoffs expanded, and it feels like we kind of saw like a lot of immediate effects. I think some of that will level out. There are a lot of knee-jerk reactions. This video could be considered a knee-jerk reaction to one season of all of these changes kind of coming to fruition with the portal, NIL expansion, and there's going to be more changes. It's not going to stop. Next season, I don't think we're going to get the same college football playoff format. I don't know if we'll get the one that's the same as that the following season. Things are going to keep changing, but the NIL game, if that doesn't change, which to me, I expect certain regulations to be put on this as time goes on. So I think it's possible that it does change, but for the most part, it's just, look, Ohio State did what they did, but I think there's a little bit of a misconception to what they did as well. Ryan Clear from Dawg Post asking the question, does Georgia need to take this a little bit more seriously and start shelling out more money to these teams? I can't talk about specific numbers and give up some of this, but I know for a fact that Georgia has refused to give certain players a certain amount of money, and that they're okay letting guys walk if that's what it's about. Kirby wants to establish a culture. He wants to build from the ground up. He wants those redshirt freshmen to wait their turn. He wants the people like Carson Beck. Before Carson Beck went to Miami, he was waiting around for his turn at Georgia. He wants players like that. Well, the game's changing. People are impatient. We're talking about, look, it wasn't long ago that I was 18, 19 years old. And if someone was going to throw a couple $1,000,000 at me to do something I love, I did sports media at Georgia. If Arizona State or Syracuse or Northwestern or one of the other programs was like, yo, I'm going to give you some money to come over here and do this over here, I would have had to really think about that, right? As someone who's just paying for college and all that and going through that and want things to be better for his family. So it's important. But the misconception with Ohio State's roster is that they went out and they bought all of these transfer portal players. They got two guys. They got two really, really big names, and obviously their center as well turned out to be a big grab, so we'll call it three, but with Seth McLaughlin. But they went out and they got Caleb Downs on the defense, and they went out and they got Quinshon Judkins on the offense, and they went out and they got Will Howard. So 4 transfer players. Will Howard, to me, was not this big-time get, and neither was Seth McLaughlin. He was a guy that Alabama ran out of there after his poor performance at the end of the season a year ago. So those weren't big grabs. Judkins was a big grab, and Caleb Downs was a big grab. But the rest of the roster is the same, and it's the guys that they built up the last few years. It's the guys that have lost to Michigan 4 times in a row. It's the guys that lost to Georgia a couple years ago. Emeka Egbuka, Lathan Ransom, JTT, number 44, their defensive end. Those are all guys that were there in 2022 when Georgia beat them. So they're players that have been around for a long time. Well, what did they? Part of what they had to do was pay to keep the roster, right? To keep guys from transferring. There is a certain point. I know that people don't want that, but why do you think Damon Wilson left Georgia? Seriously, think about the entire situation. I don't know if he has any ties to Missouri, but think about the entire situation. He's on a championship contending team that was just in the Elite Eight, if you want to call it that, of the college football playoff. He was on the team before that barely missed the college football playoff. He knows the history of Georgia. He's been around. it was his turn to kind of be the edge rusher for Georgia and be the guy that people look at as a game wrecker on Georgia's defense as one of the main guys and potential for that 2026 NFL draft if he has a really good junior season. And to do that for Georgia, the team that he's been building with, the team he's been growing with, and he goes to Missouri, a team that largely underperformed this season, a team that did not compete for the college football playoff, and a team that's just not on Georgia's level in a lot of ways. And he goes over there. And if you're going to sit here and tell me that it largely doesn't have to do with money, I mean, I saw the thing about him making plays and making opportunities, and that was one of the reasons why he wanted to go over there. Okay, well, that was all there at Georgia, which is a completely better situation. So I don't really want to hear that part. I would imagine that money was involved, and that's probably what had to do with this decision, I'm sure. Well, Georgia has money. It's got a lot of money. It's got a lot of donors. It's got all these collectives. If this is the game and there aren't changes and there aren't caps and there isn't a CBA here in the next few years and there's not a lot of organization and things just kind of remain the way that they are, which I don't think they will be, then Georgia probably needs to dig a little deeper into its pockets, because it won't just be about going out and getting Zachariah Branch and going out and getting Noah Thomas. It'll be about convincing Damon Wilson to stay. It'll be about convincing people like Carson Beck to stay. Obviously, a lot of Georgia fans moved on from Beck when he got hurt and moved on to Gunnar Stockton. But my point is not about whether or not that should happen. My point is about keeping your guys and keeping your future NFL players on your roster. Maybe Georgia does need to shell out more money. I don't know if Georgia's going to give a quarterback $4 or $5, $6 million or whatever it is that the reports are that Carson Beck is getting from Miami. Is Georgia going to go out there and get a guy like that? I'm not. Obviously, Arch Manning is not entering the transfer portal or anything, but if Georgia wants to play the game, do they go out there and they offer Arch $7 million to come to Georgia? Those are the things that, if they aren't considering and things don't change, they probably need to start considering. Because look at Ohio State's roster. And look at Michigan's roster last year. Those championship rosters are reminiscent of each other. They've got NFL talent all across the board. They've got the coaching, and they're just not missing much. That Ohio State team isn't missing much. It's got pretty much everything you need. And that's why they're in the national championship. And that's why they're making some of these other teams that are doing the same thing as them look pretty silly, because they did it at a better level and they convinced guys to stay. Kirby needs to be able to do that. Georgia needs to be able to do that. If this is going to be the name of the game, I think that it's got to be that way for the most part. Now, Kirby, Georgia, wants to do it a certain way. And they want to do it more like the way it's been. And I think that things are changing a little bit. I still think that the real model should be a mixture, right? Because now the transfer portal does exist. You got to dip into it, and you want to grow from within. And that's what Georgia's trying to do. And I think it can still work, right? But they still have to go out there and get those guys. Now, you could say, Ryan, well, they went out and they did it. They went and they got Zachariah Branch. They went out and they got Noah Thomas. They did that. They didn't go out there and get any real defensive talent, which is a question mark to me. So is it going to be good enough? Georgia's defensive recruiting out of high school is just as elite as anybody's, maybe the more elite. I mean, I'm thinking about Georgia's defense, and we're pretty fresh off of watching Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith out there run around and attacking Matthew Stafford out there in the snow yesterday in the NFL playoffs. And you're like, okay, yeah, I mean, that's Georgia's defensive recruiting. You think about how Nakobe Dean is hurt. He's usually out there. Keely Ringo's out there. They've always got the guys under Kirby, and they're continuing to do that. So maybe they're not going to dip into the transfer portal for defense as much, but on the offensive side of the ball, that's what they're doing. I just think it's time to consider dropping more money out there. If the game is going to be pay for play and Georgia wants to be as elite as it was right before this era of college football really took off, because I think we are in a transition period still, then yeah, they got to dig in deeper. They've got to pay to keep Damon Wilson. They've got to pay to keep, someone from going to the draft, right? Convincing a guy to go to the draft. That's something else that Ohio State did. And part of that is those guys were angry, but Georgia players should be angry this season too. And I'm not saying that Malachi Starks shouldn't have gone to the draft or some of these other guys, but pay them to come back. If this is the name of the game, this is the name of the game. And I think Georgia needs to dig a little deeper into their pockets if things don't change. Thanks for watching.